Principles on Resettlement. We'll be very strict on time. My name is Teresa Arnesen. I work for the UN Human Rights Office in Geneva. I want to thank my colleague on the mandate of the Special Rapporteur on the right to adequate housing for organizing this webinar and for inviting me. We will kick off very shortly so that we have as much time as possible for the discussions. Just a very warm welcome. This webinar is a webinar simply in English. It will be recorded. So in case you have any concerns about that, be mindful that this will be publicly available afterwards. We will have 2 rounds of presentations from our participants, and then we will have 2 small rounds of questions and answers. In between that, everyone who has a burning question, you're free to put it in the chat, and then our colleagues will read it out as we get to the right session. I'll be very strict on time so that we get as much time as possible to discuss between us. So we'll just kick it off. We are so happy to have you with us, Mr. Rajagopal, the UN Special Rapporteur on the right to adequate housing. You recently presented your report towards guiding principles on resettlement, review and assessment of current laws, policies and practices to the General Assembly. We are really looking forward to your presentation about this report. I just want to give you the floor immediately so that we can hear from you, and a very warm welcome once again. We can't hear you there. Just a second. Colleagues on the technical team, are you able to help out here? We'll look at sorting this out. I'll give an introduction of the other panelists in the meantime. We're really lucky to have with us a mix of very experienced people with experience from international organizations, businesses, private sector, development finance institutions, and academia. And I really think that there's a lot of appetite to discuss what the Special Rapporteur is outlining is in his report, which is one of 3 reports on this issue, and exactly what is human rights-based settlement mean practically, human-centered resettlement, what does that mean in practice? How do we ensure that people are able to participate in resettlement decisions and the implementation of such? I'm trying again to see if the Special Rapporteur is able to speak now.
His mic is still on mute.
Yeah, his mic is on mute, and unfortunately, we're not able to unmute it from here. I think that if this is the case, colleagues, I'm just briefing you in live time here, if we can go to start with one of the other presentations that is still from the participants' reflections on resettlement challenges and the recommendations from the report. Should we proceed like that? We improvise as we go. Thank you very much. I see everyone nodding. So maybe, if I may, Ramani Kunanayagam, you are the former chair of the inspection panel at the World Bank. That's a very interesting position that you've held, and would be very much interested in hearing how you link the findings of the report to the role of development finance institutions. Thank you very much, and you have 4 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, and also thank you for the report, which I found was actually very rich in terms of its coverage, looking at all the various international guidelines and standards, but then also looking into national law and development, the role of development financial institutes, as well as the case studies. But I guess my first reflection is, there is a plethora of, guidelines and standards and policies on resettlement. And, each of the multilateral development banks have, versions of the same. I mean, the principles are the same, but there's different levels of, I guess, detail or emphasis there. And now, the special rapporteur is also, requiring or asking that there's a a compendium of guidelines. For me, I feel what would be very useful is if there was some kind of harmonization of all these, so people are not lost in this mass of standards and guidelines. And I think I've worked in both the public sector and the private sector, and especially from the private sector, people get very confused by all this, and what is the default position, and I think it can have also a perverse incentive, meaning, oh, there's so much of this stuff, we're just going to do what we think is best, and that's not a good place, I think, to go. Another reflection I have is, and you said it yourself, Teresa, and the report is very clear there. What does human rights-based resettlement mean? And I don't disagree with this at all. But, like, for example, in an institution like the World Bank, they don't talk about human rights because it would look like you're infringing on sort of the political or the sovereignty of governments, which is where the World Bank cannot go as a development financial institution. So, and I think, for companies too, they understand about impact, they understand about harm, they understand about do no harm, they understand about risk. And then when you bring in a layer of human rights, they're like, what does this mean? And, why is this, different? So this would be another sort of reflection I had on the report. And I think that has to be made clear. What is the implication here, or what is the distinction here compared to other international standards? I also sort of felt, there are, and the report does cover this, but, it would be helpful. And I think this is something the special rapporteur can really bring to the table, is the distinction, between involuntary resettlement as a result of mega projects, big infrastructure projects, whether they are public or private sector driven, where, the government can, involuntary resettlement is when the government has the right to evoke eminent domain, versus where you have displacement due to natural disasters. And of course, the report does talk about this, what happens now with the, with the climate challenges, and we have climate refugees and people who are displaced as a result of that. So that is not caused by a particular project or a particular loan or particular financing or an investment. There could be indirect linkages to that, but certainly no direct linkages. So what are the implications there? And also displacement and loss due to war and conflict. And that's a whole different story. And then you have the sort of, the overlapping of, well, obviously of refugees and basically displaced persons. So I mean, these were some of my thoughts. I mean, have I eaten up all my time? Because I don't want to go further, Teresa. So shall I stop here?
Thank you. That's an excellent introduction to these discussions. We'll give you the floor again later. I'm so happy you brought up these perspectives, which also shows a little bit the difference in discourse between institutions like the World Bank and the human rights system. We finally have the Special Rapporteur with us to clarify all of that in his introductory remarks, presenting his report. Please, Special Rapporteur, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Teresa, and I'm sorry I had some technical issues, so hopefully it's all clear now. So thanks again, everyone, for joining, and particularly my gratitude to my fellow panelists. It's lovely to see many of you again, and I'm really grateful to all the input I've received for not just this report that I presented at the GA, but also the last report to the Human Rights Council. Just want to say that actually I intended to do what I'm doing is basically to present 2 reports to lay the groundwork about resettlement, and then to present a draft set of guiding principles to the Human Rights Council. So the first report was this March to the Human Rights Council that made the case about why resettlement is a standalone human rights crisis. In other words, when people are displaced because of conflict, disasters, climate change, or mega development or other projects, the displacement itself is the first crisis. But then when you don't resettle them, they go through another crisis, which is a silent crisis, which is less noticed and characterized in human rights terms. It has been long acknowledged in international human rights law that displacement or evictions that don't comply with human rights standards are a grave human rights issue. But resettlement has never been looked at that way. It's very much been part of what you might call as development practice in the case of World Bank and others, or other funding agencies, when it involves development as a justification. And then because of the increasing sort of incidence of conflict-induced displacement, which involves internal displacement as well, many countries, for example, countries like Colombia, or international organizations, including UNHCR, have tried to sort of take account of the large number of internally displaced people due to conflict, although UNHCR has often struggled with it, as we all know, because of its mandate to look at refugees, not IDPs. Within countries, if people don't cross a border, often it's kind of unclear what the mandate of the UNHCR might be. So it becomes an issue. But climate change is another potentially an area that opens up a large number of people who are displaced because of adverse effects of climate change. But so far, the number of people who are crossing borders remains somewhat small. Most people who are displaced due to adverse effects of climate change remain internally displaced, often just a few miles away from their original places of habitation in most cases. But this might very well change. It all depends on how bad things are going to get when it comes to climate change. So my report in March laid out the case about why resettlement, or the terrible record on resettlement, needs to be recognized as a silent, standalone human rights crisis on its own terms. And then what this report does is that, well, if it is such a human rights crisis, then what are some of the practices that we find around the world in terms of what states and international organizations and IFIs and private sector do? And there are some positive lessons, but also some very sobering or some concerning lessons about where things are. That gives us a sense of the practice. So the first report made the case about the crisis in more general terms, including impacts, but the second one looks at practice. And in the light of this, I hope to convene a series of consultations, including regional consultations, over the course of the next year. Before these consultations are launched, I hope to put out in about a month's time a set of draft guiding principles to be shared publicly with the international community and civil society and international organizations at large. And they have ample time, maybe up to a year, to look at it, to comment on it. And we will also convene regional consultations to engage with groups in Africa and Latin America and Asia and Europe and of course North America and so on. But the idea is to receive adequate inputs, to revise these guidelines, to present them in a more consolidated form to the Human Rights Council in March of 2026. That's basically the plan that we have right now. So I just want to say that I think that the broad point that I would make is that I think we need to sort of discard the myth that displacement and resettlement are acceptable in the public interest in the case of development projects. Of course, resettlement might be necessary where survival is at stake. For example, people truly fleeing conflict or adverse effects of climate change or disasters. Those people deserve to be resettled according to standards that meet human rights law. But increasingly, it's less and less possible to justify that there is some mythical public interest for which development-related resettlement needs to happen. If indeed it has to happen, it needs to meet much higher standards than including the standards that we find in IFIs, including organizations like the World Bank, which while there are two differences, I would say. One is that while they are based on what they consider to be best practices, say from a development economics perspective, there is a clear utilitarian justification, for example, behind ESF 5, the World Bank standards. But human rights standards are not utilitarian. They're based on a recognition of the rights of individuals. And none of the IFI or other standards that exist, well, of course, there are proliferating standards over the last several years, but none of them are really anchored in human rights. Partly because they consider that human rights is beyond their remit. They don't want to formally acknowledge human rights and so on. So they've never quite made an effort to check if the approaches that they have actually are consistent with human rights. And I would contend that, in fact, they are not at this stage, and we need new standards. And then the other thing I would say is that it's one thing to have standards emerging from within individual organizations for their own practice, for example, different IFIs and others. But it's another thing to have a set of guiding principles adopted by a body such as Human Rights Council, representing a wide swathe of states from different parts of the world. That's what leads to the making of international law. It's not the standards that are adopted within organizations. So the goal is very different. So yes, there are standards, but I hope this is kind of a way to respond to the point that Ramani made already. Those standards do exist, but they are practice guidelines for organizations. They are not frameworks for international law, whether treaty law or other forms of non-binding or soft international law. So my hope is that at the end of this effort over 3 reports, the world will have a set of what are possibly soft international law principles in the form of guidelines, not yet quite legally binding, but at least they are steps towards that. And we have seen a number of such efforts over the last several years, including, of course, the internal guiding principles on internal displacement from 1998, or the guiding principles on business and human rights, which are now being discussed in the form of a treaty. And perhaps that's what states will end up doing, but ultimately that's what we are. So I'll just leave it there in terms of what the sort of the overall goals were and what I set out to do in these reports. But in terms of the substantive sort of issues in the report itself, I'm happy to sort of get into it, of course, during discussion or during the next second round, I guess. Thanks.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Special Rapporteur. We're so grateful that you're doing this work and that you're building these bridges, as you say, between what may be practices and guidance internal to institutions and bridging the gap with what is actually international human rights law. We have a next panelist ready. Ryan Schleff, you're the Executive Director of the International Accountability Project, and you will help us to make the links to businesses and private sector actors in this discussion. Welcome, Ryan. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Teresa. First of all, thanks to the UN Special Rapporteur, UN Special Procedures, and other experts, including those on this esteemed panel who contributed to this incredibly valuable report on resettlement, and thanks to the Human Rights Council for encouraging these efforts. We've already talked about resettlement having various causes, but I argue that regardless of its cause, resettlement by its very nature and through generations of experience is more often than not a reliable indicator and predictor of human and environmental rights abuses. At the International Accountability Project, we work with communities around the world affected by resettlement, and we see how the private sector plays a significant role with and for the state by conducting environmental and social impact assessments, planning and implementing resettlement action plans, and by coordinating compensation and livelihood restoration programs. Private actors, often operating separately from the state, may directly engage with community members and local leaderships on all aspects of resettlement, including by hosting project-level complaint mechanisms of their own. The division of roles between the private sector and the state can further complicate a community from accessing information, ensuring their informed participation, providing accessible spaces for accountability and remedy, and overall from exercising their basic rights. These varied roles can be challenging for the private sector to navigate, given diverse local and national laws and customary practice, especially around eminent domain and land acquisition, the policies and regulations from public and private banks, and the private sector's own policies and agreements. This reality has led to the development of guidelines and mechanisms across government, development banks, institutions, and also the private sector. Most recently, the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, adopted this year by the European Union, clearly establishes a duty of corporate due diligence for large companies to prevent adverse human rights and environmental impacts, not only in their operations, but also across their value chains. While there is space for improvement here, this directive, along with the incorporation of the guiding principles on internal displacement and other policies and standards, are helpful to clarify the duties and responsibilities of the private sector. However, resettlement itself as a unique occurrence, a unique catastrophe, truly requires further articulation. Finally, this report addresses the challenges faced by the private actor space involved in resettlement activities and recommends important considerations, including addressing from the design stage onwards any potential human and environmental risks, providing remedies for adverse impacts, as well as halting harm and preventing its reoccurrence, and also encouraging improved compliance within the private sector. These and other duties and obligations the UN Special Rapporteur has written about earlier can be further articulated in an eventual guiding principles on human rights-based resettlement. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ryan, specifically for making this point about the role that private actors take versus the role of states, where we have states that have different obligations and companies that have responsibilities related to human rights that are quite different. And I think there's quite a void there to fill, which gives us a big hopes for the treaty and also gives us a very warm welcome to the latest EU directive. I want to give the floor immediately. I'm sorry, I muted myself before giving the floor to Jim Robinson from the NRC, Norwegian Refugee Council. Jim, you're the coordinator of the Global Protection Cluster on Housing, Land and Property. And we want to hear from you a little bit more about the role that you see for international organizations. Thank you, Jim.
So much, Teresa, and thanks to UN Special Rapporteur and to UN Special Procedures for creating this space to discuss this and for allowing me to be part of it. So I'm here as the co-coordinator of the Housing, Land and Property Area of Responsibility. That's part of the Global Protection Cluster, and I'm sort of partly representing the Global Protection Cluster in that way, and also the joint submission we made to the Special Rapporteur from the GPC, the Global Protection Cluster, and UNHCR as well. So I'm going to be speaking to this report from that perspective, so from the humanitarian response perspective. And it's really interesting to hear already some of the other colleagues and trying to make the connections with these different actors and stakeholders in this work. I'm particularly keen that we emphasize these links between the humanitarian emergency type context with the role that private sector can play, that development actors can play, and of course the wider context in which the state ultimately has the primary responsibility for its citizens. So I just want to sort of frame it in that way, and that will be the perspective I'm speaking from. And we see resettlement and relocation as consistent large challenges, a big issue that we face in the context of humanitarian crisis, sometimes linked with development projects, and sometimes those ongoing works can make it more likely that people might be needing to be resettled or relocated when some kind of crisis hits. But I think it's also really important to emphasize that in itself as well, that in our work with shelter responses, with the site management, camp coordination, camp management, protection colleagues, livelihoods, we see a lot of challenges around relocations and resettlements. And I think it's just worth stating, as comes through in the report, that resettlement should should be a last resort. And it's already been mentioned that when you see it happening, it's often indication that there might be other things going on. And I think we need to really remember that. Again, emphasize the role that states have. But if we are going to see this resettlement take place, that it must be in compliance with the human rights standards. We must look at the right to remain, the right to return, and only if these aren't possible, then we might look at how resettlement might be done as an option of last resort, ensuring massively important, meaningful consultations with those that are affected. And we see it as part of the kind of the frameworks and the principles around durable solutions, for example, in terms of response to a crisis. There's guiding principles on internal displacement. There's the Kampala Convention that do talk about resettlement being done if it's done in the right way and in a way that upholds the rights and interests of those that are experiencing it. But I think that's the key if. It's the key but, right? It's like when those things are in place, they have to be followed. And I think as international organisations in that space, we're often involved in the programming and the supporting the work that's happening, but we're also there to bear witness, to hold to account, to advocate, and that is something that we can do. Because one of the things that comes up again and again with these resettlements, relocations, if they're absolutely necessary, to what degree are they time bound? Is there transparency on how this is communicated? Are there considerations around how it's going to affect maybe more at-risk groups? Is it voluntary? You know, that's a key component when we're looking at durable solutions. And how does it link in with people's access to livelihoods, education, and all the other things that link to the right to adequate housing? In terms of the specific challenges for international organisations working in a humanitarian context, I wanted to talk about it from two perspectives. One is for the affected people, so those that are experiencing that resettlement, or maybe are in a place where people are being resettled to, and then for us as humanitarians working in those contexts, that might be being drawn in to support relocation or resettlement initiatives. So for the people themselves, it's often IDPs in a humanitarian context that are the target of such relocations. Often they're seen as not being allowed to stay where they have settled, that they need to be moved for a number of reasons. And these can be reasonable reasons as well. For example, if people are occupying a school, it might be they're in some kind of community space or a health facility. And we've seen lots of examples of that recently, where people are seeking shelter, trying to stay in wherever the place they can, but that space needs to also be used for other things. And there's a tension between those different rights and responsibilities, and how do we support those people. We also see some examples where people have been resettled and they haven't been given the full information, or maybe they've been given certain promises around access to resources, maybe food, electricity, other things as well. And then that can lead to tensions with those communities that are surrounded in terms of access to education. How transparent are these processes? How engaged are people in these things that are going to really affect them? I think we also can see that an initial assessment might show that this resettlement could be positive, it could be helpful, but over time, are we monitoring that? How are we making sure that the increased tensions with local community are considered? And demographic changes do have an impact, so we need to be mindful of those things. I think a key one with any relocation that is being sort of pushed or encouraged, is it temporary? Or is it permanent? We see examples where in an emergency life-saving situation, people need to be moved. And if they're coming back in a few weeks or months, maybe that can be okay. But sometimes that's not clear. And the relocation can happen. It can be essentially forced upon people without them knowing what the outcome's going to be. And again, we see real concerns around this in a number of the crisis situations at the moment. And people don't know if they're allowed back, and that can even stop them wanting to move or leave their space where they currently reside, because they fear that this relocation could be permanent, even if people aren't saying that. And I think that's a real thing that we need to watch out for. In terms of the recommendations that came through in the report, I thought there was an interesting one around in the recommendations for states around establishing a global mechanism to receive and consider complaints related to human rights abuses in the context of resettlement. I was thinking that's something that states would be involved in as well, but there's a role for international organisations and the others represented on this call in kind of making that happen, and maybe in terms of making sure that the right kind of data and analysis is part of that process. But I thought that was an interesting suggestion, and would love to hear more about how that could possibly work. And I think the overall sense I had from the recommendations for international organisations was the need for coherence, coordination and collaborative approaches that really cut across the different parts of a humanitarian response, but also linking with those that are working on solutions, the work that's being done by authorities, the work of the private sector, peace, conflict, development. All of these actors will need to come together and have some kind of joined up approach. And we see it again and again to make sure that we are doing right by those people that are being subject to resettlement or maybe are wanting to go on that journey. So yeah, I'll leave it there, but happy to have any questions or pushback or whatever. Thanks.
Thank you, Jim. Thank you for bringing the humanitarian perspective and for linking what we're talking about to the lives of the people on the ground. You'll have an opportunity to speak later on as well. I want to give the floor now to Indrani Sigamani. You're a researcher and senior international development consultant. You'll provide some reflections on different entities and actors here. The floor is yours. We're looking forward to hear your views. Indrani, are you with us?
Sorry, can you hear me now? Okay.
Yes, all good. Thank you.
Just want to say thank you for inviting me to speak, and thank you for sharing this detailed report. Actually, I really enjoyed aspects of it, which I thought were quite bold. For instance, it was the first time somebody has actually said resettlement needs to be avoided, that it has universally had adverse effects on communities. And this is just something known, but I don't think people have actually been able to say that as you know, clearly as in this report, which I appreciated. And another thing that I found significant is the unchecked use of eminent domain. Saying this, it's the first time I've seen this sort of critique of the use of eminent domain with such clarity, because before this, I mean, it's always been a given, you know, with World Bank funding and extractive industries using, it's just always just been a given. And another aspect which I wholly endorse from your report is paragraph 45 and 46, in which you challenge the justification of displacement and resettlement for economic development when they override public interests. And thank you for referencing the Fair and Equitable Land Access Dublin Declaration, FELA. It's really reassuring to see that it's being valued for its contribution to land rights. The comment I want to make actually is to bring up power imbalances that both this resettlement guidance and FELA challenge. And I just want to say that this report is written within the human rights framework, and displacement and resettlement, except for climate change, are often part of policies in which governments don't necessarily either adhere to nor engage with human rights ideologies. And Romney brought that up initially, saying some people have problems with it. And the poor outcomes and negative impacts of resettlement, unquote, I think can be perceived as a result of this dichotomy in which, on one hand, the guiding principles assume human rights, while on the other hand, displacement and resettlement policies engineered by national governments do not necessarily comply with human rights. At the state level, for instance, in countries such as India, which my research is based on, we have very enlightened legislation. The report referenced LARR, which is the Land Acquisition, Rehabilitation and Resettlement Act of 2013, and the Forest Rights Act of 2006 actually, for the first time, brings in aspects such as self-determination, through Gram Sabha decision making and gender equality, all of which are integral, but integral to the law. And problems arise when governments either ignore these vital aspects or, at worst, which is happening right now, repeal these progressive parts of the law, which of course exacerbates forced displacement and resettlement. As Professor Rajagopal talked about, it's not on the table. People are just left to their own devices, and that is frightening. Another example, for instance, 5 years ago in 2019, India's Supreme Court ordered the eviction of forest dwellers, most of whom are indigenous communities, in 16 states whose claims for tenure security on ancestral lands under the Forest Rights Act had been rejected. The problem was that the number of rejected claims was more than 2 million. And I'm not even going to go into the social aspects of the trauma of facing imminent displacement by human beings. But legally ordering evictions violates, for instance, the legal framework of the Forest Rights Act, also violates the Indian Constitution, Article 21, which protects the fundamental rights of life and livelihoods. And it violates international norms such as the Dana Declaration of 2002, which is the first and only declaration unique to mobile indigenous peoples. And I'm bringing this up because my research focuses on mobile indigenous peoples, and the Dana Declaration recognizes them as a group and advocates for their land rights. And it's important because they are more vulnerable because they're on the move. So, land security has, and terra nullius laws are just open to exploitation for mobile indigenous peoples more. And so my point is, it creates a dilemma, especially because it questions the role of national government in the protection of the rights of citizens in relation to right and adequate standards of living and the right to non-discrimination. And that's basically what I want to say in these 4 minutes, is this dichotomy of, on the one hand, having human rights framework, and on the other hand, having, governments, states, nation states, who don't necessarily adhere to these norms. So I'll leave it at that.
Thank you very much, Indrani, and we'll hear from you soon again. Really appreciate how you and many others have highlighted that the people that are often most concerned by resettlements or displacement, they're very often those that are in more vulnerable situations. It's not the richest, it's not the most powerful, it's not those that necessarily have their voices heard more in general, and that's why it's also so much of a human rights issue here in. We have very little time for a brief question and answer session. If anyone wants to type a question in the chat, please do it now. And if not, we will be gathering questions for the question and answer session that we have towards the end. My colleagues will help me look out for those questions, and I don't see anyone, so I just want to move on a little bit because we've been discussing the current report and the recommendations therein, but we also want to inform the next report and really the guiding principles for resettlement that the Special Rapporteur is currently developing. So I want to give the floor back again where we began. Ramani, you have another 3 to 4 minutes. If you have some reflections around this, some recommendations maybe for the Special Rapporteur, the floor is yours, please. Ramani, can you hear me? Yes, great. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much. So I'll just make some closing remarks, sort of high-level remarks. I think the first thing I want to say is, if the ultimate goal is to move towards some kind of soft law on resettlement, and then perhaps an international treaty, I think, I guess there's a balancing act here in terms of what you want governments to sign up to or states to sign up to in terms of high level principles, and how much do you want to go in terms of depth of practice, and I think that's a balance. For me, it's hard to sort of provide a specific recommendation, but I see the dilemma here because one, I think it would be hard to have a soft law that, I mean, is it directed towards the states or is it directed towards the private sector or both? Because private sectors definitely would look at this in terms of from an economic development perspective, right? They're there to build a project, or and then resettlement is a unintended or consequence of that, or something. So I think in the World Bank, people like to talk about the development dilemma, which is, on the one hand, you do need economic development for prosperity, countries, but not just countries, regions need infrastructure, and then the consequence of these projects can be harmful, especially to local communities, of which resettlement is probably one of the most severe of that. So how do you balance that? And I think in that context, I would like to point out that actually the avoidance principle is the first principle in the World Bank and IFC standards, also in the Asian Development Bank, I think amongst all the multilaterals. So the first principle is to avoid resettlement. And I've sat on both sides of the equation, and in the inspection panel, when we get a case on resettlement, the first thing we look at is how did the bank go about trying to avoid the resettlement? But there are options here to avoid the resettlement, and if not, there's the whole kind of mitigation hierarchy: avoid, minimize, and if you can't do avoidance and minimize, then how do you mitigate? So then we would look at, did they try to minimize the resettlement? And sometimes minimization has its own issues in terms of, I think it's quite interesting having worked on projects, because I have worked on projects where you have a community that is completely divided. There are those who've complained to the inspection panel because they don't want the resettlement, or they feel the resettlement is not being done correctly, and they don't want to be resettled. And then there are those within the same community who want to be resettled because the resettlement offers them better standard, better quality houses, better opportunities, etc. So I think some of these dilemmas are important to be recognized. I think, when you go into the next iteration of this, and to bring in, I think, a combination of, people who worked on projects or worked on, who've had to develop this and manage these on the ground, and then those who are advocating for those who have been harmed and who have been, negatively impacted by the resettlement. I think you've got, that's important. And my last point is, I've always been very concerned when there are like a lot of recommendations in anything, because the more recommendations you have, the easier it is for those who are resistant to find ways around not doing anything, because everyone gets caught up in all the arguments around why they don't like the X or Y. Whereas if it can be distilled into some very clear, few but very clear recommendations that are principle based, I think that makes it in a way easier to push through. Of course, I do want to add this, although I did say that was my last point. Having worked on and headed up a big international accountability mechanism, I can tell you how hard it is to, accountability is under stress and under pressure everywhere. There are huge forces who are trying to restrict independence, accountability, the ability for people to be able to look at a project without fear or favor and write what they found without any influence. And I think the idea that you can have now a sort of a total independent accountability mechanism that is not tied to any organization, I mean, I would wish you luck on that, but I don't see that happening, at all, if I'm quite honest. I mean, having worked in the World Bank and seen, executive directors representing 188 countries who find it really difficult to agree on something that we would consider, really quite small and basic. I think to get that kind of coalition, which is not tied to an institution and doesn't have the institutional support at like a high level board, I think that would be a problem. That would be challenging, let me put it that way. But thank you.
Thank you so much, especially for the very honest insight about how things work and what considerations are made here at the end. I want to give the floor immediately back to the IAP and to Ryan, please. You have about 3 minutes, max.
Thank you. These are important points that are being brought up. For myself, in our work at International Accountability Project, we talk more about preventing resettlement, avoiding resettlement. I understand the articulation, but it almost seems like it's an inevitability. It's something that we have to dodge or take on. And there's something about the role of even preventing resettlement whenever possible by the actors. It puts the onus of responsibility and duty, I think, a bit differently. But in the rare instance that resettlement does happen, if that's an environmental disaster, if it's because of conflict, resettlement should be human rights based. And the people impacted should be decision makers. That's the ideal. I mentioned earlier how involved the private sector actually is in resettlement. They're often relied on, throughout a resettlement process, designing, implementation, where we don't see a lot of coherent activity is on transparency, is on engagement with community in a free and fair way. Also, there are a lot of challenges with the project level complaint mechanisms that the private actors may set up, and how communities, engage with those and the challenges of engaging with those. Sometimes the companies are foreign companies. They may have their own rules and policies. What we see at the International Accountability Project at the local level is finger pointing among the actors, and a lot of inaction as various parties choose the law or policy that best benefits them at the moment. And this does switch and swap at times, but it's hard to get unified understanding of duties and obligations across the various actors. And I feel that guiding principles would help ensure the rights of communities are prioritized over commercial interests. So the private actor, regardless of how they're involved in the resettlement, involves some sort of contract and involves some sort of revenue and risk, whether that's economic or reputational. And we often see that those commercial interests are heavily weighted over the proper engagement and respect for human rights of the communities. And the absence of these guiding principles, for us in our experience, just causes a lot of confusion and misapplication of the existing guidelines, standards, and mechanisms. It doesn't work to fill the protection gaps or actually clarify the full scope of existing rights for communities that they have. It's quite narrow and limited, and a fuller articulation that pulls in the scope of the existing standards, but also works to fill the gaps would be very, very helpful. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ryan. I want to give the floor immediately back to Jim on behalf of the Global Protection Cluster. 3 minutes to you as well. And just a big thanks back to Ryan for highlighting that it's communities and their rights that are really at the center of this. And this is what is being overlooked when we have a corporate approach very often. And that is where the human rights-based approach makes the difference. Jim, over to you.
Thanks so much. And thinking forward, as it were, to guiding principles for resettlement, I think that emphasis on them being resettlement, relocation being a last resort is really important. Again, to try not to to move away from it. I think someone said earlier it being an inevitability or almost normalized as something that happens. And at the same time trying to make sure we're really clear on the criteria when it might be appropriate, and then if it is going to happen, making sure that the processes and practices are in place to minimise the risk, but also maximise the protection of those that are affected by it. I mean, I would, from my perspective, really urge some kind of, at some point, some focus on what happens in the crisis contexts, whether it's a disaster, whether it's conflict, whether it's something else, when often those can be seen as a, an opportunity for relocation that then turns into something more permanent and more problematic. So I think a real kind of clear link there. And I think something that within the humanitarian sector ourselves are trying to do is make better, more proactive links with those working from a development, with authorities, with private sector, with environmental, peace, conflict, all of those different perspectives. So something that sort of tries to draw those things together, because I think in a humanitarian context, there are things that we can be doing right from the beginning that are going to make sure people are clear on, the rights they have to be in a certain place, what they have in terms of the right to adequate housing, but also linking to their own sort of housing, land and property rights as well. And there are various processes and practices that we try and support that need to be happening right at the beginning, but are also relevant for anything longer term as well. So making that connection, I think, would be really valuable, and would be a really valuable platform for that to happen, certainly for us to be able to draw on and refer to and advocate related to that as well. I think a lot of things have been mentioned, but any of these processes that are deemed necessary because they are a last resort, just to making sure we put the dignity and the safety of those affected at the heart of what we're talking about. So how involved are they? What sort of engagement have they had? Are they able to develop solutions themselves, the people that are affected by this? And when we're talking about housing, land and property specifically, there's clear approaches for sort of due diligence that make sure we understand the different tenure relationships people have. And I think this is really important, because when you're seeing people moved or resettled, well, what is the connection those people are going to have to that land? And is it affecting different people in that group differently, depending on their status within that group? So I think we need to be really clear on that, understand the potential for discrimination and where there can be a lack of access, not only to housing, land and property they need to live safely and securely, but also things related to adequate housing, around livelihoods, education, etc., etc. I think a key thing is how we engage local authorities on that, and that's something that maybe as international organisations we can do. We can advocate, but we can also support building the capacity or working with these colleagues in the authorities as well. And remember that they are the primary, providers of this safety and security for their people. And yeah, that emphasis on free and informed decision making. So if people are moving, how do we make sure that is there? And just looking really clearly and practically at the places where people are being relocated to. Like, are they free from unexploded ordnance? Is it a floodplain? How are they able to access services, or how close are they to urban centres? And is there ongoing urban planning or settlement processes that this needs to be included? So making sure things are joined up, essentially. And I think the only way to do that is to have a real involvement of all stakeholders, like we've discussed, I think, from lots of different perspectives. And yeah, I think I'll leave it there for now. Thanks.
Excellent, Jim. Thank you so much, really, for speaking about the interrelatedness of rights, including talking about land, which is really key here in tenure security, and the role of local authorities as well, that we didn't hear so much in the past. We have one last speaker that's allowed to give her last 3-minute intervention before we move to the Q&A. Indrani, please, the floor is yours. Okay.
I'm just going to take this going on into a bit more abstract area. We're talking about the mechanisms to hold people accountable, questionable practices which lead to human rights abuses and enforces the displacement of large numbers of people. And then we get into this whole, humanitarian aspect of resettlement. And the report, there's some very solid guidelines represented by the report, charting the range of human rights abuses and how to proceed, how to mitigate, what actions can be taken. And it's just in terms of a paradigm change, where we're also looking at all this happening within a political economic hierarchy, world power. And I'm just going to take you to an example of, for instance, Sudan. At the moment, there's been, I think, 7.7 million internally displaced people, 2.2 plus people who have been refugees. And there was repeated violations of the ceasefire agreements. And so what happened, the US president issued an executive order in May authorizing sanctions for those deemed responsible for destabilizing Sudan. And they talked about committing human rights abuses. And the language was, you know, similar to what we're referring to right now. But my question is, so when something like repeated ceasefire violations of ceasefire agreements happens in other places, such as such as Gaza, you know, we're still dealing with this economic and political power of the world order, where there is no executive order, there is no authorizing sanctions, but we're looking at a huge resettlement problem, and we're looking at huge human rights violations. And we're also looking at countries such as where I live in the UK, Germany, the USA, who are allied with these human rights abuses, in contradiction to how, you know, they respond to Sudan. And my question is, I know it's beyond the remit of, you know, a special rapporteur, but I think it's sort of reminiscent of, do you remember in the late 70s, early 1980s, when we went from WID to GAD, from women in development to gender in development, and the paradigms changed. And within women in development, we were talking of the oppression of women within the patriarchal structure. And with GAD, we broke it open and we talked about what is the patriarchal structure. And we talked about the relationship between women and men, and it became gender. And I think that it's important for me to see this, at least put it on the table of, you know, we're talking within an economic, a world order, political elite where these structures aren't being questioned. And we're having, you know, we're watching in horror this, you know, plausible genocide happening, and countries just taking, not doing anything, absolutely not doing anything. And individuals like me, we're just looking at it with disbelief. And it's been a year now. And in terms of resettlement, you know, in terms of this debate conversation we're having here, where does this leave us if we're not going to be questioning the macro level? I'm leaving it there.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you for questioning the world order, and thank you for bringing the gender lens to this. We're running a little bit over time, but we started late, so we ask for your forgiveness. Hang on with us if you can. My colleague Maria will read out some of the questions that we've received in the chat. And after this, the special rapporteur himself will also be providing some closing remarks.
Many thanks, Teresa. Can you hear me? I've been monitoring a bit. There is a very interesting parallel discussion going on in the chat, which unfortunately we cannot get into right now. But there is one interesting question from Child in Need Institute. She's asking about the possibility to incorporate the rights of the child in guiding principles. And I find this a very interesting and provoking question. I'm not sure if any of the panelists would wish to address this. Or if not, we could invite Swati herself to say a few words how this may work.
Can I just say that it's actually part of this report, children, women, indigenous peoples are all listed as vulnerable populations. It's not been disregarded.
Well, maybe I can just add that yes, it's very much listed, and children are very adversely affected, and they have special impacts when it comes to displacement and resettlement. Decisions are often taken without, meaningful involvement or participation by young people, including children. But on the other hand, the basic problem we have is that we really don't know, how many of those people who are displaced or are subject to resettlement, or they belong to different vulnerable groups, because the data very often that countries collect is missing. Very few countries do a systematic collection of, for example, displacement data. On resettlement, if there are development projects on a project by project basis, especially if there is an external financing, it may be possible to access that data if such data is made available by the international organizations such as the World Bank or others. But this is also very, very hard to find. They are not located in one place. So one of the problems we have is simply the problem with lack of data. So yeah, is there an impact on children? Sure, probably. And from all qualitative evidence emerging from individual reporting on projects and the input we receive from affected groups, it appears that way. But I don't have the ability to say what the extent of that impact is in the absence of this data. So it continues to be an issue.
Thank you. Thank you to the Special Rapporteur for answering this question. We are open to questions if anyone wants to take the floor as well. You can raise your hand if you can find that function here on Teams is usually on the top menu. You can type in the chat again. And if not, we may want to give the floor back to the Special Rapporteur and he can deliver his concluding remarks here as we're already a little bit over time. I don't see any hands. Let's give the floor back to the Special Rapporteur then, please.
Thank you, Teresa. I thank you again all for your very valuable comments and reflections, which will help me enormously as I do further work to finalize the set of guiding principles. And I hope to remain engaged with all of you, but also those of you who are participating in the discussion during the course of the coming months, whether directly with you or through the regional consultations that we'll be organizing. I just want to sort of offer some final sort of remarks that basically sort of anticipate what I'm thinking of in terms of the key elements of the guiding principles. And there I want to start by expressing my strong agreement with Ramani that perhaps this is a case where less may be more, in the sense that I don't want to come up with, for example, 50 principles that might be important to be considered by countries and so on. The fewer the better might be a better approach, as Ramani said it, and I am fully in agreement with that, and my approach probably will reflect that as well. And in terms of what those key elements are, I think that the report tries to indicate what some of them are. We start with the basic premise, as many of you have said, that communities have a right to remain where they live, that resettlement should be a last resort. And so we are talking about this trifecta of rights that people have: the right to remain, the right to return, and the right to be resettled if return is either not possible or they're unwilling to return. So we have to actually create this clear recognition in international law of these three rights. Right now, they are kind of dispersed all over the place. Some rights are recognized somewhere, but not together. And it's important to recognize that these trifecta of rights apply. Resettlement, as many of you said, is really a last resort, and strong safeguards must be in place to ensure that communities don't become worse off, and in fact, benefit from resettlement when resettlement has to be done with the participation or involvement of communities. That is, in other words, even if communities sign off on resettlement because there is a development project, and in the case of indigenous people, the standards are higher. That needs to be free, prior, informed consent, which unfortunately I see a terrible record of around the world. There are very, very few positive cases where such free FPIC standards are actually met. We need to go beyond that. We need to look at benefit sharing really in resettlement. And some countries do offer some examples of that. But this needs to be the standard in terms of human rights law. I also agree that the site selection is extremely important and because it has deep implications for livelihood restoration and integration support, including relationship with the host communities, which can be really screwed up if site selection is not done in a smart way. The question of compensation is incredibly important, especially when land is lost because of natural disasters, which is one type of calculation. But when land is taken for more beneficial use, for example, the same land is going to be reused for another development purpose, as is the case with development projects, for example, creating an economic corridor or an infrastructure that actually sort of is supposed to bring greater benefits. And the communities are willing to go along with that because they are truly engaged in a participatory process and they've given their consent in the case of indigenous people. Then there must be a way in which these communities can actually fully benefit from that process. They must be involved in all stages of the resettlement process, from the design stage to the initial discussions to exploring of alternatives to implementation and monitoring. Now, implementation and monitoring, as I say in the report, are very weak at this stage. The frameworks often are followed up to a point, but often the real challenges with failure to resettle people emerge quite a long time after resettlement takes place. It could be 2 years, 3 years, or 5 years down the road. Often, in fact, those impacts are not monitored because projects don't have the ability or budgets to engage in that kind of monitoring. So we are actually in the report, for example, I call for a need to have contingency funding and other sorts of support built into the project cost. If you want to develop a project, you have to be able to absorb those costs to develop a project. Otherwise, the project is not worth pursuing, basically. I know it sets very high standards, but all that could be said about all human rights principles. Human rights principles do set high standards, and that's the whole point of upping the game when it comes to, things that we are more comfortable with. We need to change the way things have been done. Grievance procedures and accountability mechanisms are incredibly important. And the comments that you all offered is extremely relevant there, including Ramani's comment also about the increasing challenges to independent functioning of even even mechanisms that are within institutions, such as the complaints panel of the World Bank or other ombudspersons or other mechanisms that exist. It's very important to be conscious of that, and I'm fully in agreement with that. I've also suggested in the report a global mechanism, perhaps through the Human Rights Council, that is anchored in a framework similar to or within the special procedures mechanism, where we do have the experience of recruiting independent experts, such as myself, who are able to be involved in impartial assessment of information that we receive and to take action based on that principle. So the states are familiar with that mechanism. So if I suggest something like that, it's not going to be entirely unfamiliar to them, but we will see where we go with that. And I'm very eager to I'm looking forward to the feedback from states on some of those key issues as well. So I just want to say, so I just look forward to working with everyone, states, international organizations, development institutions, civil society, and particularly affected communities, which I hope to really continue to sort of engage with and finalize these principles over the course of the next year. Thank you again all for joining me.
Very warm thanks to the Special Rapporteur, all the panelists, all of you have joined. We didn't lose a single one of you whilst going 15 minutes over time. We take that as an indication that there's tons of interest in this topic. There are plenty of opportunities to stay engaged with the Special Rapporteur to support him in his work with the guidelines. There will be regional consultations. There are opportunities to provide written input. So please use that opportunity and stay in touch with all of us. Thank you so much for joining today.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, all.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye. Cheers.